Games Workshop are seeking to please Gork and Mork today with some hefty greenskin previews. Let's check out the new faction and army rules for the boys. Looks like it's going to be big melee damage from the greenskins as they charge into 10th. Hello and welcome back to Warspets Tactics, where today we're talking Orks. Continuing in their faction focus series, Games Workshop has turned their gaze the way of the greenskins, perhaps one of the biggest and most iconic factions that they have yet to show off, a very popular army in Warhammer 40k. In the reveals, we've got a fairly similar format to the rest of the faction focuses, a fair few interesting general army trends with some previews of some important gear and rules that will affect a fair few units. The army-wide rule is Waaagh. It remains a one-off big boost that just applies to one battle round now. The benefits that you get really are quite good for it though. The launch detachment is the Waaagh tribe. This one kind of feels like a Goth-style detachment to me. The main benefit is a melee boost, and the stratagems that we've had previewed look like they're going to be focused on getting your models to fight in combat. Looks like melee orcs is going to be the generic flavour until they get their codex out, it would seem. And then we've got a usual mix of weapon and unit previews. The Stompa Weapons have been shown off. There's a Squig launcher from that Squig Buggy, two rather good stratagems in my opinion, and then the new profiles for the Snagga boys and the boss himself, Ghazghkull Thraka. Loads to talk about, so let's jump straight into it then. And first up, we've got a few army trends that could give us a few clues to other datasheets. It appears that now we've seen both the Snagga boys and the Weird Boy for the Orcs both have a 5+ save. It seems very likely that the standard Orc save is going to be a 5+, or from their traditional save of a t-shirt 6+. It appears that they have got their toughness 5 remaining from 9th edition, and this 5+ save really is quite a decent improvement to them, particularly if they can get cover. There's a lot of weapons in 10th edition that have AP reduced, so it is going to be meaningful against a fair amount of things. Hopefully fairly good news for Orc infantry hordes maybe. The more survivability that they have, the better that they tend to do. It would appear that the general faction leadership is usually going to be a 7+ for Boyz and an 8+ for Gretchen if Makari's anything to go by. 7+ isn't exactly a big surprise in 10th edition to be honest, really quite a lot of armies have that, and Orcs if anything were doing worse than normal before. Battle Shock's definitely going to be a thing for them, but I feel like leadership's going to feel like less of a faction weakness as opposed to something that everyone's got to deal with. Perhaps one of the biggest losses for the army that it looks like we've got is that Here We Go appears to be gone. This is the Orc reroll charge rolls. They've had that basically throughout 8th and 9th edition, and now that looks like it's gone. That will give them a little bit less reliability in getting to combat, though I suppose you can still always budget a command point if you really need a critical charge to go off. It appears that the rule has been reinterpreted as a stratagem, a fairly strong one for getting units into combat in the Waaagh detachment. From the Snagga boys profile, it still seems that Orc knobs seem to be a thing with 2 wounds on their profile. Orcs have arguably done better than a fair few factions there that seem to have basically lost their squad sergeants, or at least in terms of having different stat lines. A fair few armies only seem to have their sergeant really denoted by war gear now, and I guess as Orcs are a bit more meaningful by getting the extra wound for them, that might be why they've retained them. Otherwise, one nice confirmation is that choppers still get AP-1 apparently. That's something that I was kind of surprised at, as really quite a lot of AP-1 things have dropped to AP0. Good news for the boys and the Snagga boys being generally effective against infantry there. Still means that they should be at least decently dangerous to things with a 3+ and 2+ save. Finally, it appears that from Ghazghkull's datasheet, Dakka weapons appear to have been consolidated into rapid fire. I did notice that with the new rapid fire rules, you could have weapons that fired out, say 2 shots to 24 inches and then 3 shots to 12. Looks like Dakka weapons probably are keeping their same sort of feel to them. They'll just be more under the rapid fire class now and not necessarily get double the shots, but just get some extra ones when they're up close. They'll still not necessarily be hitting all that much though, as the ballistic skill still remains as a big 5+, something that's not going to deal with modifiers very well. Getting into the previewed rules proper though. First up, the Orcs army-wide special rule is Waaagh. This is going to be the one that's not dependent on detachments, and they just all get in each of their formations. In 9th edition, you either had Waaagh or Speed Waaagh, depending on whether or not the force was led by a war boss or a speed boss, but now it looks like this is no longer dependent on having a war boss lead your army. If you did have a themed force of say a big mech leading his contraptions around, you would be able to access this now. Out of these rules, this really does feel like the reinterpretation of just the standard Waaagh rule. Speed Waaagh does not really appear to be a thing here. I really wouldn't be too surprised to see that return though, say in one of the detachments when their codex comes out. The buffs from this Waaagh are fairly melee focused, and you trigger them at the start of the battle round, potentially in your opponent's turn if they went first, and then they last until the start of the next one. For the benefits of calling the Waaagh, you get 3 different buffs. The first big one is Advance and Charge. This one's now for all Orc units, not just core and characters. Really quite a massive boost to their threat range there, with an extra d6 inches on top of your 2d6 inch charge, never mind your movement. This is still going to feel absolutely massive as a great big surge to get your Orcs into combat, and it's really quite big that this can apply to quite fast things now. I guess you could have things like battle wagons with death rollers hurtling into the enemy from quite a long way away. The next part is a melee damage buff. You get +1 strength and +1 attack. That one's the same as the current boosted Waaagh that we got in the Balanced Data Slate update around about mid last year. +1 strength and +1 attack is usually going to be very helpful to just about any unit. The +1 attack is basically flat extra damage. The +1 strength is going to matter a lot more in certain fights than others. With a new stretch toughness chart, there's a good chance it might not up the wound roll bracket, but I guess any time it does, it will be pretty meaningful. Again, you can't really go too far wrong though with extra attacks. Finally, and perhaps one of the best benefits I'd argue, is that every model gets a 5+ invul save for the turn. Really quite excellent in an army that's generally got at least fairly poor saves. Still, a 5+ save isn't exactly the best in the world. That applies both at range and melee, and it could be interesting that I guess you could trigger this in your opponent's turn, and then you basically have a bit of a defensive buff before you get stuck into the charges yourself. It is interesting having to call it at the start of the battle round. That could have a bit of a different feel depending on whether you're going first or second, I suppose. If you've gone first, then on whichever turn that you call it, you're going to be surprising the foe and they don't know it's coming. Whereas if you're forced to call it in the opponent's turn, they might have chance to react to your calling the Waaagh and know that you get some very long charges this turn. They just might have a little bit more information. Overall, it looks very decent though. I think most armies would likely want to be calling it either turn 1 or turn 2. Turn 1 might be a bit early, as you might not have the chance to charge things unless your opponent's advanced really quite a lot. I feel like turn 2 might often be the way to go. Get the big swing in the game early on, but not too late, but hopefully slightly after your forces have started to actually engage each other. Going alongside that, and we also have the new Orc detachment. The launch detachment is going to be called the Waaagh tribe. This one appears to be your fighting melee Orcs detachment. It perhaps feels like the equivalent of Goths for 10th edition. I'd guess that this would represent them if you wanted to field a Goths themed force. Maybe we'll have other detachments that fit the fighting styles of the other clans. Until the book drops though, it looks like Orcs are just going to be extra fighting. The benefit of this one is that melee weapons with Orcs models get the sustained hits 1 ability, so basically extra hits on 6s. If your Orcs were going to be hitting on 3s before, usually that's a 25% damage increase, arguably even more meaningful on things that hit on a 4+. I feel like you can't really go too far wrong with just flat extra melee damage. It might be another thing that inflates the value of combat units over and above the shooting units. Though obviously, even with layered special rules like this, it will kind of depend on how much they've costed the points of each of these. You could still have Orky shooting be very, very strong if they've costed it cheaply for what it does, even if you don't have layered special rules on it. I can't help but think though, if they have tried to balance shooting and melee for being detachment agnostic, it might mean that melee is just going to have a bit of an advantage over shooting, at least for the initial period following the launch. Talking of shooting though, we do have a few weapon profiles shown off. The first one are the Squig launchers of the Rocketruck Squig Buggy, the Orky food truck that seems to function as artillery apparently. The way that these are called the Squig launchers now, as opposed to Heavy Squig launcher and just Squig launcher, makes me think that the two gun profiles have all been rolled into one. I think the profile probably does back that up as well. You've got d6 plus 6 shots on the attacks, and previously it had around about that many shots, but just broken down into two different profiles. In terms of the gun itself, it remains 36 inches, strength 5 and damage 2. It has lost a pip of AP, and it looks like the weapon only hits on a 5+ now, at least unless there's any other special rules on the datasheets to make it hit better. It has indirect fire, and it gets to ignore cover, which is kind of good as that's one of the debuffs that indirect fire brings. I feel like unless you absolutely desperately need a few hits on a unit that you can't see though, it's usually going to be better to fire it direct. Have it hitting on a 6+ rather than a 5+ from indirect fire would be a massive hit to its damage output, cutting it in half. As always, will depend on the points. I'm not sure it's the profile that I'm the most excited about though, going into this new edition. The indirect fire mode just seems a bit on the weak side if you're only averaging 1 or 2 hits. Next up, we've got some big damage weapons from the Stompa, the Great Big Death Cannon gun, and the Mega Chopper close combat weapon. The Stompa really does have a history of being a unit that's kind of terrible to field in game. Games Workshop seem to be pretty reluctant to make it good for the points cost. I feel like their general balance ethos is not to have too many super heavies stomping tournament tables. You never know though, maybe 10th edition might be the Stompa's day. It was already confirmed to have a toughness 14 profile, which sounds like it's going to be resistant to a lot of anti-tank weapons. Even so though, it's not even guaranteed to be durable for the points if they cost it very high again. The weapons that we've had shown off are the Death Cannon, which has basically got a very similar profile to before. 3d6 shots at strength 14, AP 3 and damage d6. Fairly impressive on numbers, though hitting on a 5 plus really does tone that down a bit. Without external buffs of some sort, which might or might not exist, it only averages a bit less than 7 wounds to a rhino for an average shooting phase. Not awful, but also not amazing for a Titanic primary weapon. To be fair, I guess it is only half the story. There will be the Super Gatler to back it up as well, and that should also add a fair bit of threat and stacked saves. The Mega Chopper as well does look very threatening. It is enough damage to basically average a dead Imperial Knight in a single turn if it can catch up with one. I feel that Stompa's main issue sometimes might often be actually getting into combat with the enemy though. It's got a massive profile that might struggle to move around terrain, and it might often have its own units or enemy units getting in the way. Hopefully they do manage to make it a bit more playable this edition. I feel like it's been a unit that's been overcosted for far too long. Next up, we've got a couple of Orky stratagems. First one, the Fights in Death one, called Orks is Never Beaten. I did quite enjoy the flavour text of the reinterpretation of this one, saying that Orks are sometimes so slow on the uptake that even killing wounds might take a while to register. This one is one that we've seen in a few different flavours in other detachments in the game. It costs 2 CP, and basically this one is a Fights on Death rule. When your Orks get attacked in combat by something, you can trigger this stratagem, and then for any destroyed models, they get to fight before they die. Getting a whole fight phase out for a threatening unit certainly could be worth 2 CP. I guess the best idea for this one would be to use it on a really scary melee unit that's just about to get wiped out by some oncoming enemies. It's kind of fun that this one looks usable on any Orc unit, so I guess in theory you could use this on something like Ghazghkull Thraka or a big Orc Stompa or something. You do have to commit to it though before the enemy actually makes their attacks, so you might well be throwing some command points down the drain if it didn't even die. Overall looks pretty solid though. It won't come up literally every game I suspect, but when it does, Fights on Death can be pretty game changing. Shown off stratagem is Here We Go, reinterpreted from the army-wide rerolls to a new stratagem to give one infantry unit a big boost into combat. This one's one command point, and you do have to commit to it quite early. You have to do it at the very start of your movement phase, so presumably before you've moved anything else. Might just require a little bit of thinking ahead there, and whether or not you need to get to certain targets, or you might be able to handle them with shooting or something. I guess at the start of the movement phase as well, it probably wouldn't allow you to do this on a charge from reserve type unit. Kind of a shame for that one, as a 7-inch charge out of reserve would have been pretty nice. The stratagem's a fairly simple one. It gives you a plus 2 inches to your advance and charge rolls. I think either of them are handy enough, though it's almost certainly going to be biggest in the turn of the Waaagh, when you can buff both of them and still charge, so a 4-inch on whatever else you had. Taking the Snagga boys that we'll talk about in a second as an example, they'd be 6 inches plus d6 inches for advancing, an extra 2 inches for this on your advance, and then charging will be 2d6 inches plus 2, averaging just over a 20-inch average threat range overall. Really not too bad at all for standard Orc infantry. That is some pretty scary movement there. If Storm Boys happen to have a 12-inch movement still, then that would be a very scary over 26-inch movement just on average. A pretty terrifying charge threat range, and if you roll high then that could be even further. Seems handy insurance to get one of your biggest scariest units to the fight. Finally, we've got a couple of Orky datasheets. First up, the Snagga boys. Games Workshop's new Savage Orc reinterpretation looks like they've got a little bit better on their raw stats in my opinion. They've been beefed up in a few key areas. Looks like they've got a movement of 6 inches now rather than 5. Really quite a handy little extra bit of movement to have if you're surging forward on foot. I feel like that will be felt in some slightly easier charges they might have. It seems that they're remaining toughness 5, some really good indication that the standard boys are going to be as well. Previously they had a 6 plus invul save built in at base. It seems that now rather than that they've been upgraded to a 5 plus regular save as mentioned earlier, and also a 6 plus feel no pain. Both of them are good to be honest, though out of the two I'm perhaps slightly more excited by the 5 plus save. If you can get one or two of them the benefit of cover, that will add to the unit's durability significantly, particularly with so many small arms going down to AP 0 again. The 6 plus feel no pain is very nice against damage 1 weapons. That will be effectively a 20% durability boost against those, though it is going to be really bad against anything damage 2 or more. You're very likely to ever save a model with feel no pain if you're having to roll more than 1 dice. Still though, being 1 wound infantry, 1 damage attacks are the things that generally kill them the most efficiently, so I definitely wouldn't say no. Otherwise, their choppers retained the strength 5 and AP -1. Nob's power snapper has lost a pip of AP, though is still quite general purpose. They appear to have a mob keyword, which might be something for which characters can join them maybe, and it looks like their datasheet special rule really plays into their monster hunting abilities. Each time the unit makes an attack against a monster or vehicle, you get to re-roll the hit roll. Seems very nice when 6s are going to be getting exploding 6s as well. It means that each attack that you get on vehicles and monsters, you'll actually be averaging more than 1 hit on the enemy. Overall seems solid enough. I definitely like the 5+ save. Finally, we've got the big boss himself, Ghazghkull Thraka, and this guy's seen some changes that really reminds me of the ones that Abaddon saw. Perhaps just being a little bit less of an out-and-out monster in their own right, and now he's going to be a bit more of a squad leader as opposed to a lone entity. It looks like Ghazghkull has actually literally lost the monster keyword despite being absolutely enormous. He's now got the infantry keyword instead, which should mean that he can interact a bit better with terrain, though he has certainly lost a decent amount of movement with that. Only moving 5 inches is going to be pretty rubbish for him. In terms of what he's going to be leading, the article that Games Workshop had confirmed that he could lead Meganobs. I'm not sure whether it's just going to be them or whether it might be others as well. If I had to guess, then maybe 2 of the other units that would be most likely to allow him to join might be the regular Nobs or the Boyz. I guess either way though, he is going to have a decent amount of bodies to tank damage for him now, rather than being out in the open. For the squad that he's leading, he does make their damage output significantly better as well. He'll give his Meganob entourage a +1 to hit and to wound the enemy, both of those pretty enormous damage buffs. Against certain tougher targets, that might equate to almost double damage against them compared with if Gaz weren't leading them. And it does look like that +1 to wound as well would also apply to Ghazghkull's attacks himself. And given that he's already strength 14, he's usually going to be wounding a lot of things on a 2. Looks like he'd lose that if he was independent again though, it only applies while he's leading a unit. In terms of his defensive stats, he has lost out a bit compared with previously. As with Abaddon the Despoiler, his durability rules have been toned down really quite a lot. He's only toughness 6 down from toughness 7, he's only 10 wounds compared with 12, and perhaps most importantly, he doesn't have that phased damage cap anymore, so you might well be able to eliminate him in a single round of shooting if you get lucky. It looks like Makari is along for the ride in the same unit though, and he has the potential to make Ghazghkull very tough to remove indeed. Makari's rule is basically like the Drukhari Archon Shadowfield type rule. As the boss's lucky banner waver, he has his 2+ invulnerable save once more, but with the provision that you can never re-roll it, so once he fails it the first time round, he basically dies as he only has 1 wound, and he's only got a 7+ save, which is hard to pass on a standard d6. I feel like that really is quite a meaningful damage debuff. As anyone who's used a Drukhari Shadowfield will tell you, they're not exactly reliable, but for those miniatures, they're generally protecting a fairly fragile character, and here they're protecting a big boss who's tough in his own right with a 4+ invul and a 2+ save. In addition to invul save duty, Makari also has a Ghazghkull's Waaagh banner rule. When you call the Waaagh, Orc units within 12 inches get lethal hits in melee. Really quite nice to have full stop, but maybe particularly good for getting things like choppers to punch up against vehicles. It'd work very nicely with the Beast Snagga boys, who could reroll everything that wasn't a 6 due to their rerolls against those same targets. Finally, for his actual damage output, Gork's Claw has 6 attacks now, hitting on a 2+ at strength 14, AP 3 and damage 4. Pretty solid and fairly similar to what he had before. Previously he had that weird degrading table where his movement and strength got worse but his attacks got better. It looks like in 10th edition Ghazghkull just doesn't have a degrading profile whatsoever though, so you don't need to worry about his damage output going down. Mork's Roar also seems to give us an example of a Daka weapon as well, 12 attacks that goes up by an extra 4 attacks when you're within half range, rather than the normal doubling thing that rapid fire weapons tend to do. It has a lot of pip of AP, as with a bunch of ranged anti-infantry guns. It's still not going to be a crazily meaningful weapon when he's hitting on 5s. Overall, I feel like Ghazghkull has definitely changed in feel of the unit, a lot more of a squad leader than an individual melee monster, and I perhaps wouldn't be too surprised if his points cost had dropped a little bit going into 10th. Still looks potentially very scary though, big damage buffs, a slightly spooky Shadowfield type save that might tank a lot of damage that would have killed him otherwise, and of course a very respectable melee profile as befits the Prophet of Gork and Mork. Overall, I feel like the Orcs haven't done too badly in terms of flavour and cool rules out of their faction preview. Waaagh still seems very decent. Looks like the Detachment preserves the spirit of the Goths, which were the strongest of the clans currently at least. I do quite like the Here We Go stratagem with the big extra charge threat range in Waaagh, and I feel like the 5 plus armor save is going to be very nice for standard Orc infantry. I feel like a lot of their specialist boys tend to cost a lot of points but die very easily just due to only wearing t-shirt saves. Otherwise, hopefully you can at least use some decent Orc shooting units. Looks like there doesn't look like there's a whole load of external rule support outside of their datasheets. They might be absolutely fine just based on points cost alone, but hopefully they're just not left waiting until the codex comes out until they can actually get good. In any case, let me know your thoughts down in the comments below. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, or I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming, with new ones out just about every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description if you'd like to help support. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.